teaching in this way. So it's hard to imagine hard to imagine me seeing you all out there in the kind of public forum and having to go back to this method. But thanks for inviting me to this, and the GFT have been doing some great work in terms of trade union education, in particular labour history and the history of our movement. And I've been involved with the GFTU for a number of years now. By way of introduction, I just wanted to say something about myself and kind of personal connections to coal mining communities. I was in school in the summer of 1984, and I remember witnessing the scenes at Orgreave on television. And I was in a house of a close friend, and I remember the kind of really negative reaction to what was perceived then to be the violent behaviour of picketing coal miners. And I was in a community where there was some coal miners, but there were lots of other different occupations as well. My father was a colliery deputy, so not directly involved with the National Union of Mine Workers, and I'll talk a bit more about some of the divisions within the industry a little bit later. But I had two uncles who were on strike in the Lancashire coalfield. None of them were at Orgreave, but they knew people that were. A little while after that, in 1985, I started in the industry myself, age 17. I went down the pit in the spring of 1985. And then, obviously, the union had been really hit hard by the defeat of the strike. And I was in a working environment where the NUM was extremely weakened by the defeat of the dispute. And also, it was threatened by the breakaway union of democratic mine workers. So I found myself putting myself forward for election as youth delegate to the National Union of Mine Workers, and through that is where I was then able to piece together the history of the National Union of Mine Workers and the history of the coal industry. Coal mining goes back generations in my family to the 19th century, so I have scattered memories of the key disputes of 1893 and 1926, and of course 1972, which I'll also touch on a little bit later. So kind of fragments of stories from those disputes were passed down through great grandfather and grandfather, and became part of that, I guess, kind of oral history and collective memory of coal mining communities. So 1984 was obviously some kind of return to those scenes and those sentiments and those emotions. But in many ways, within the months and the years that followed, the industry was completely eradicated from British society. One of the things I think which is really striking, and again, by way of putting some context into this, if we go back to the First World War, 1914, there were well over 1 million coal miners employed in the British coal industry. And even by the time of the miners' strike in 1984, 1985, there were still around 200,000 miners employed in Britain. Now we just have a smattering of coal miners in a few small mines. So we can see the scale of the eradication and the dilution of the industry, but also the National Union of Mine Workers as an industrial and a political force. And I think with Orgreave, and I'm going to focus on Orgreave more centrally throughout this presentation, and hopefully take a lot of questions and we can discuss a bit further. In some ways, Orgreave is read not just as one of those defining moments in the defeat of the National Union of Mine Workers and the collapse of the industry and the subsequent closure of it, but also in wider terms, being looked at or framed as the defeat of old labour or the defeat of the industrial militancy of trade unions, which had been constructed as being some kind of political and social problem in the 1970s. And again, I'll challenge some of those assumptions and some of those mythologies as we go through this session tonight. So I have a kind of personal background within the coal industry. And this is something that, I keep returning to at various points when I speak at miners' reunions, events organised by particular former areas of the National Union of Mine Workers, and also the General Federation of Trade Unions. And as was already noted in the introduction, it's the 40th anniversary of both the miners' strike and the events around Orgreave in June 1984. And I think that's really symbolic as well if we trace what has happened to the labour movement and the left, and in particular the big industrial trade unions from that period, from the 1980s and through to the present day. We've had some positive, I think, developments on the horizon, which might come out of the victory last week for the Labour Party in the general election, specifically in terms of Orgreave and an inquiry into Orgreave, but also in kind of ushering in a new period for the Labour movement to flex its muscles and hopefully initiate some of the changes that have led to the destruction of working class communities and the eradication of trade union rights throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. So again, I think Orgreave looms large within this particular period of British history. So that's just a kind of general introduction that I'd like to give around this. And one of the things I think that's also crucial to remember here is that Orgreave itself and the miners' strike itself are often seen as this titanic struggle between the left of the labour movement and the trade union movement, represented by the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, Arthur Scargill, and then the figure of Margaret Thatcher, this conservative prime minister who wielded the sword against the trade union movement and introduced a raft of anti-trade union legislation. I think, again, that's a really simplistic view. When we look at the miners' strike and we look at the origins of the dispute, and indeed Orgreave itself, this wasn't about one leader of the National Union of Mine Workers. This was a grassroots struggle to defend jobs, to defend communities, and really hold back the forces of this particularly virulently right-wing strain of conservative politics. And we've seen the results of that kind of politics in the years that have followed the defeat of the miners in that dispute between 1984 and 1985. And I know there'll be people with different kind of levels of knowledge of the strike and the general narrative of the strike. And Orgreave kind of occurs right in the middle of the 12-month dispute. So I'll just fill in a couple of those gaps before we get to Orgreave itself. So the dispute starts in March 1984, and it's quite a messy start because the strike is obviously developing in particular areas of the British coalfields. There were grassroots mobilisations and area mobilisations against the announcement of mine closures in Scotland and in South Wales, and then you get the announcement of the closure of Corton Wood in Yorkshire. So you've already got a lot of picketing activity and militant action taking place before the kind of formal beginning of the dispute in the first week of 1984. One way in which solidarity is developed throughout the dispute, and particularly in those early days, is by means of flying pickets, and it's picketing which remains crucial in terms of the events of Orgreave. So within some coalfields, you get mass solidarity and miners coming out on strike, and in some pits, there's not even a need for a picket line. The kind of the mobilisation of action against pit closures is solid. The solidarity of the miners at the level of the colliery and the area also solid. Obviously, there's more divisions in other areas, and I'll touch on that a little bit later when I talk about the legacy of Orgreave and the miners' strike. But it's picketing in 1984 that's crucially important in terms of spreading solidarity, in keeping up morale, in trying to diminish the power of the government in terms of attempting to stop coal being transported to power stations, and in the case of Orgreave, stop coal being transported to coking plants and having a particular significant impact on the steel industry. So picketing becomes important both as a strategy for the National Union of Mine Workers, but it's also used negatively by the media and critics of the miners' strike. So basically, create this sense that it's the miners that are responsible for picket line violence, and in the case of Orgreave, violent attacks on the police. And again, a lot of those characterizations have now been, destroyed by the evidence and retrospective analysis of the events on the 18th of June in Orgreave. The interesting thing here is that obviously amongst miners themselves, and within the wider Labour movement, there was always a keen sense that a huge injustice had taken place at Orgreave, that police had attacked the miners, that we've now seen wide-scale evidence relating to the corruption of police officers, and now we have this big push for a public inquiry. So as a historian, it's really interesting comparing how the media constructed the events around Orgreave in June 1984 and in the months that followed, but also now how more analytical studies by a whole range of academics, but also political activists, campaign groups, and the unions themselves to get to the truth about what happened during the Orgreave dispute. And I think there were some kind of oppositional voices here in terms of how picketing was being defined, particularly in the right-wing tabloid press in the mid-1980s and in the events leading up to Orgreave. A study that was carried out by the New Statesman in the early months of the strike, argued that actually, if you look at a lot of picket line activity during the dispute, there was very kind of low levels of clashes between striking miners, those that were seeking to break the strike, particularly in parts of the Nottinghamshire coalfields and across the Midlands, and also within kind of this connection between pickets and local police forces, kind of a relatively safe environment for both pickets and police. No examples of violence there. This comes later into the dispute. So there are pieces of evidence that suggest that even at the time there was a challenge to these images of violent pickets that were being constructed by the mass media. One of the other things about Orgreave as well, I mean, often within the press, and obviously in retrospective accounts now, they tend to focus on this specific day, the 18th of June 1984, where we get the big clash between, it's up to 10,000 miners, striking miners, and around 5,000 to 6,000 police officers. But tension had been building up in Orgreave throughout from kind of late May and then into June. So this was a kind of ongoing toing and froing between miners and the NUM, picketing coking plants like Orgreave, and the attempt by police to minimise the effectiveness of those pickets. So there was a bit of a pre-history here. And there's an even longer history, and this we might come to this in the Q&A when we're looking at the effectiveness of picketing and the differences between what happened at Orgreave and what happened in earlier industrial disputes. Often Orgreave has been compared to the battle for Saltley Gate during the 1972 miner strike, the effective use of mass picketing. And when I come to the end of this presentation and we look at kind of alternative interpretations around the use of the mass picket and what happened in Orgreave, we could make some kind of connections and comments and similarities and differences between 1972 and 1984, but also the effectiveness of picketing today. I mean, I think because this is an issue for trade unionists, affiliates of the General Federation of the Trade Union. Is picketing still an effective strategy for trying to generate solidarity, but also maintaining the effectiveness of disputes? I'll be interested to hear what you could say about that. But it's the 18th of June and the Orgreave coking plant, which I'll focus in on now. And lots of you have probably seen the kind of the news footage of this and snippets in recent documentaries that have come out in light of the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike. The contrasting images, I think, are quite stark. So you have the picketing NUM members, often just wearing short trousers, T-shirts or no shirts at all, and training shoes. And then you have this kind of paramilitary police force with batons, with shields and horses. And in some ways, it's almost like a kind of medieval battle between these kind of, mine workers who are kind of dressed for a sunny day with nothing to protect themselves, and then the police with the batons, with the horses, and with the shields. One of the things about the violence at Orgreave is as well is that, and this comes out of lots of the oral histories which have been collected, in the aftermath of Orgreave, but also in more recent works and more recent books, is the fact that miners felt that they were almost invited into that space at the Orgreave coaching plan, that the police seemed to not be kind of harassing them in the same way until they got into that particular location where they could be corralled and then be attacked. And I'll touch on this a little bit later. So I think that's one of the important aspects of this. If you look at how picketing was being policed in the kind of weeks leading up to Orgreave, this kind of marked a watershed moment where it seemingly the pickets were being beaten down by a police force that was using violence. And some of the testimonies that come out actually from the other side as well, from the police side, in recent years, and hopefully this will form part of the inquiry, where there are interviews done with police officers at the time who witnessed senior police officers telling other police officers that they've essentially got the freedom to do what they want and react in the way that they want to in terms of dealing with the effectiveness of the pickets. So you have this big pitched battle on the 18th of June. So the battle takes place within Orgreave itself, but it also then spreads into the village, which is close locality to the coking plant. I just want to show you a book which has recently been published by Robert Gildart. It's Backbone of the Nation, Mining Communities in the Great Strike of 84-85. I'm reviewing this at the moment, and there's some really good testimony in here from miners themselves. One of the strengths of this book, it's rather than being the interpretation of a historian, it uses the oral testimonies of the miners and the miners themselves to tell the story of the strike, and in particular Orgreave. So I'm just dipping into that at the moment, just to write a bigger piece on the legacy of the miners' strike. So some of those images that you will see, it's a pity that I don't have clips here to show you, but you can see large amounts of pickets, the police charging them, and stones being thrown. One of the things that has come out subsequently, and again, this was known by miners and the National Union of Mine Workers at the time, but it's now been validated by a whole range of different sources, is that actually miners throwing stones and other items at the police was in response to the horses charging at the pickets. And what happened on the evening of 1984 on BBC News is that film was reversed. So we now know that, contrary to what we saw on our television screens in 1984, and kind of where I started my anecdotal piece about watching this in a friend's house, that it was the miners throwing stones at the police and then the police charge. It was actually the other way around. So we can see here, it's not just the right-wing tabloid media that were constructing negative images of picketing miners and the National Union of Mine Workers and their struggle against pit closures, but it was also media outlets like the BBC. So there's a question here about impartiality as well. So these violent scenes are replayed on screen, and in some ways, and again we can discuss this as we get to the end of the presentation, in some ways Orgreave's seen as a key moment when public support for striking miners starts to become much more diminished, because the way in which Orgreave is presented, and there are 100 injuries, mostly to miners. I think it's 95 arrests that were made, and as we know now, the arrests were made on trumped up charges of violent conduct, riot, and affray, and most of those cases collapsed in the subsequent court cases, because as we now know, that a lot of the evidence and a lot of the witness statements by the police were completely fabricated. Arthur Scargill, the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, was himself hospitalised. And again, if you look at some of the footage of this, you can see him he's hit by a shield and then falls down a kind of grass verge. So, he was at the forefront of the struggle that day, as well as were many other activists from the specific areas of the National Union of Mine Workers. The other point about this, I think, is what happens in the aftermath of the battle, the so-called Battle of Orgreave, in terms of the police and the court. And I've already mentioned the fact that a lot of the statements made by the police had been fabricated. They had kind of one model or one version of what happened on the day, and that was the thing that was the characterization of the day, which the police went with. All this became relatively easy to unpick by the NUM's legal team. Some famous names in there: Gareth Pearce, who've been instrumental in campaigning for the release of the Birmingham Six. Michael Mansfield, again, a lawyer who has worked closely with trade unions and other community groups in seeking justice for innocent people from the 1970s and down through to the present day. So that kind of struggle for truth and the struggle for justice carries on to this day, and I'll talk a bit about the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign and the recent setbacks, but also hopes for the future, given the election of the Labour government as we get to the end of this. But just going back to the general narrative of the strike, so as I've already noted, March 1984 is when the strike begins. Orgreave comes 4 or 5 months in June 1984. And really, it's after Orgreave where you get further divisions within the National Union of Mine Workers, but also questions being raised in the wider labour movements about the effectiveness of picketing and about trying to keep public opinion on board in terms of the miners' struggle for their jobs and their communities. After June and then through to October and November, we get trickles back to work in some areas. And obviously, one of the big weaknesses for the National Union of Mine Workers is the fact that coal continues to be produced in Nottinghamshire in particular, but also in some other more moderate coal fields like Lancashire and North Wales, Leicestershire, and there's a trickle back to work even in some of the areas that were really supportive of the strike in those early months. I think another point here, which is of historical interest, is that really Orgreave sets the scene for the way in which the policing industrial disputes moves forward and becomes much more violent and brutal in the aftermath of Orgreave after the struggle of 1984. The Wapping dispute is one example of this, where again you see pickets being arrested, pickets being beaten up by police. So there is this, in some ways, there's a kind of two-track process here in terms of the Conservative Party, what it's trying to do. On the one hand, you've got this draconian anti-trade union legislation that's being introduced through the 1980s and into the 1990s. But on the other, you've got the state acting in a particular way to intimidate industrial workers and other trade union members who were on strike. And it's not just the trade union movements. I mean, a lot of kind of community groups, countercultures are also finding it much more difficult in terms of maintaining their rights of freedom of assembly. One of the things I think it's often forgotten now in the kind of post the post Orgreave period, and it's the so-called Battle of the Beanfield, which takes place 1 year after Orgreave in June 1985, and this is where you get the police again violently attacking New Age travellers who are seeking to get to Stonehenge, and again there's a lot more work to be done on that, but there's a whole series of these clashes from Orgreave onwards and down into the 1990s. So that's the kind of event itself. So we can see how the perception of Orgreave and how it was constructed in 1984 by the right-wing press and by the government, and in more recent years that view has been challenged. But this also gets us to think about a whole number of issues, and one I've already touched on is about the effectiveness of mass picketing, because within the labour movement itself at this time there were some questions being raised about how effective mass picketing could be in order to gain victory during the strike, and there were debates within the National Union of Mine Workers about this and within the wider labour movement. I mean, from the outset there were tensions between the steel trade unions, the ISTC, which I think now was the Community Union, and the National Union of Mine Workers about picketing and stopping coal getting to steel plants. So Scunthorpe is one example of this. The other would be Ravenscraig in Scotland and Port Talbot in South Wales, which, as you know, is currently in the news because that's also going through a process of closure. So within the Labour movement, you did have more moderate trade union leaders that were critical of the NUM strategy here in terms of the use of the mass picket. Also internally within the National Union of Mine Workers, you have disputes between the more moderate coalfields. Nottinghamshire would be an example of this. And some of the Nottinghamshire leaders were very critical of the way in which mass pickets from Yorkshire entered the Nottinghamshire coalfield in order to prevent Nottinghamshire miners going to work. And then once there are a series of area ballots, this becomes even more messy and even more fragmented. So there are a lot of issues here that emerge in the aftermath of the conflicts at Orgreave, but also it raises questions about trade union strategy as we get through to 1985 and into the late 1980s after the defeat of the miners' strike. Because I think it's also important for labour history and trade union history. And again, it comes back to what we can think about in this session about the effectiveness of picketing. The miners' strike, both within inside the labour movement and also externally, was seen as one of these kind of historic turning points, representing the end of old labour, a pushback on the advances that the labour movement had made, in particular trade union movement had made in the 1960s and in the 1970s. So there's I think symbolically, Orgreave has become incredibly important. One thing I will mention now, I think, is the kind of legacy of Orgreave. We've looked at some examples of where you get similar police activity in terms of diluting the effectiveness of picketing. Wapping would be an example of that, but also the way in which the state and the police are all also mobilised to police particular communities and kind of put down the freedom of movement. And I mentioned the Battle of the Beanfield here. Another example of this would be the way in which the police tried to clamp down on new developments in youth culture. So the whole moral panic around ecstasy, around rave parties and unlicensed events. And obviously we have the Public Order Act that comes in. And the context for the introduction of that Public Order Act are events like Orgreave, the Battle of the Beanfield, Wapping, and other disputes. I've just seen in the chat there, I mentioned there the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, which some of you will be familiar with. And yes, check out their web pages because they've been doing great work pushing for a public inquiry. There's a bit of a backstory here as well. I think it was in 2015 that the Independent Police Complaints Commission refused to investigate the events around Orgreave. So that was the first knockback. And then I think it was in 2016, I think, where was it another pushback on that? I've got some notes somewhere. Just let me check these. Yes, 2016. I think it was Amber Rudd, who was then Home Secretary, who gave notice to say that she didn't think there should be an inquiry into the events of Orgreave because the police have now been reformed. It's very different times, and there were no fatalities on that day. The fact that there weren't any fatalities is a miracle, really, given the brutality that was witnessed on that day. And again, you can see this on your television screens and in kind of retrospective documentaries. The one kind of positive move now is that in the 2024 Labour Party manifesto, there is a commitment there to an inquiry into the events of Orgreave. So let's see how that pans out. But yeah, it's definitely a step forward. There's also been some cultural representations of Orgreave, and I think again, if you're interested in looking at this in a bit more detail and how musicians and artists and dramatists responded to the dispute, there's lots of different things you can look at here. In I think it was early 2000s, Jeremy Denner, the artist, did a kind of reenactment of the Orgreave battle. So you can find that, I think, on YouTube there. The rock band Dire Straits, their song "Eye in Hand," again that makes references to Orgreave. The Manic Street Preachers, 30-Year War, that makes references to Orgreave. And the treatment of pickets in mining communities more generally, outside of Orgreave, has been represented in a number of films. Billy Elliot, Pride, Brastoff, three examples there. But I'd also recommend the television drama Our Friends in the North, because you can see within that, and I think that came out in 1996, the way in which that pitched battle at Orgreave in June 1984 was also then recreated or emerged once more in other mining communities. So Easington in the northeast would be a good example of this. The way in which the mining villages almost became police states at this time, and I think that's one of the crucial things to remember about this. I just want to wrap up here, and then we can move into some kind of more detailed questions and comments about kind of interpretations and counterfactuals, because it's often questions that's raised about the miners' strike. Could the miners have won the strike, and would it have been any different? And in terms of Orgreave, could there have been a different outcome there? Could there be a different strategy? If you look within the NUM, you already in the summer of 1984 see these kind of schisms developing. Dave Douglas, who was a NUM activist and has published some really interesting pieces on mining history, was quite critical of the concentration of mass pickets in 1984. So even though he was involved in the events of Orgreave, he argued that there shouldn't have been this concentration of pickets in one particular location. Soon after the Orgreave dispute and in the days that followed, you also got criticisms coming from sections of the British Communist Party who were critical of the role of the mass pickets and the strategy of the National Union of Mine Workers, and also the Labour leader at this time, Neil Kinnock, who was highly critical, not so much of the miners themselves, but was highly critical of Arthur Scargill as the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers. Scargill himself still takes the view that this was the right decision, the mass picket of Orgreave, and I think recently has argued that if the mass picket would have been strengthened and more pickets would have arrived on site in the days following the pitched battle on the 18th of June, then a victory could have come out of that struggle at Orgreave, and argued that at the end of the day on the 18th of June, that the plant was actually temporarily closed. So that's my whistle stop tour really through the miners' strike, the politics of the National Union of Mine Workers, the events of June the 18th and Orgreave, but also the aftermath and the legacy. One thing I would just add there, and I think the point can't be made strong enough really, is that there's a whole kind of catalogue of examples of police corruption and police violence that predates the Battle of Orgreave in 1984. We can go back to the policing of disputes in the 1970s, the use of agent provocateurs, undercover police, and that carries on throughout the 1980s. Orgreave is one big example of this, but then later we get far more events like this that are repeated. But also the role of the state as well. I mean, and kind of many miners raised this in interviews with them. I was involved in quite a big research project between 2017 and 2021, and I'm currently going through that material because I'm working on a book on the history of the coal industry from the 1940s down to the 1990s. So the oral testimony of miners, I think, is really important in the sense that they can tell their own stories about these particular events. And two things really strike me about those testimonies. One is there was this sense, particularly in some areas of the coalfields and close-knit communities, the sense that the police had become detached from those communities. There'd been respect for the police, but that breaks down. It starts to break down prior to Orgreave, but obviously Orgreave is the big event that really reinforces that view. And one of the other things that comes out of the Orgreave testimonies as well, from both the miners and the police themselves, was the behaviour of police from different police forces. And there is this view within mining communities that when pickets or picket lines of police locally, there was far less tensions than there were when police were drafted in, particularly the Metropolitan Police, into other coalfields. That's where you get these kind of bigger tensions. And for a long time, there wasn't that much testimony available from police officers who were involved in the events around Orgreave and in other kind of in other flashpoints of picket line violence. But in more recent years, many more former police officers have come out and really verified the accounts of the miners themselves and the levels of corruption and the levels of fabrication. So that's been an interesting addition to testimonies and recollections of the dispute. And there are researchers looking at that aspect of it too. The other point I think which is important here, this kind of disconnection between local police forces and miners, is also the kind of way in which the British state itself deploys the police really as a kind of arm of capital and as a paramilitary organization to try to stifle dissent and try to deal with opposition to the policies that they're introducing throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. And some of this, again, it comes through miners' testimonies. You know, some of the scenes that they witnessed in the troubles in Northern Ireland, and that was a kind of regular occurrence on news bulletins in the 1970s and 1980s. You know, they never felt that that could happen, you know, within coalfield communities. And in some ways, it generated an interest in the struggles of other groups, both within the United Kingdom and overseas. And this awareness of the way in which the state could operate in order to put down opposition and to silence dissenting voices. And we've seen, again, many more examples of that from the 1980s and down to the present day. So I'd just like to end here with, again, really a plea for anyone who's interested in this to get involved with the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, get involved in local community mining and heritage groups. And if you're members of the Labour Party, keep pushing the party to commit to the 2024 Labour Party manifesto in having a public inquiry into the events around Orgreave, because I'm sure that many more pieces of evidence will come out of that, which will totally exonerate both the National Union of Mine Workers and the members of mining communities that were, you know, victims of police brutality on that day, on June the 18th, but also in the days and the months that followed that. And as we know, that after the dispute, there were many victimised miners who were also wrongfully convicted for their activities during the miners' strike. Right, I'll leave it because I've been about 40 minutes. I'm going to leave it